The first time she lowered her eyes for the cameras, she was 20 years old and standing outside a kindergarten in Pimlico, wearing a skirt the photographers would spend the next week describing in extraordinary detail. She had not intended to be backlit. The sun came through the window behind her, the thin fabric of her skirt went slightly transparent, and the resulting photograph ran on every front page in Britain. She blushed when she saw it. Said it was mortifying. Said she had not known. She almost certainly had known. This is not a story about a naive girl from the English countryside who stumbled into the most photographed marriage of the century and found the machinery frightening. That story has been told so many times it has worn grooves into the culture. It has been told in films, memoirs, documentaries, stage productions, and by no fewer than 3 separate television series, each confident that it alone had captured the real Diana. None of them quite managed it, because the real Diana was considerably more interesting than a victim, considerably harder to reduce than a saint, and considerably more calculating than almost anyone in the palace ever permitted themselves to admit until it was far too late to do anything useful about it. She understood exactly what she was doing. She had understood for longer than people realized. The institution she entered in 1981 had spent centuries surviving difficult personalities, constitutional crises, foreign invasions, plagues, and the occasional monarch who made genuinely catastrophic decisions about France. It had survived abdication, 2 world wars, and a press that had been sharpening its claws since the invention of cheap newsprint. It believed it could survive a 20-year-old from Norfolk who liked pop music and worked with small children. The palace was wrong. Diana was not a weather event the monarchy had to endure. She was a force it had invited inside without understanding what it was opening the door to. And by the time it understood, she had rewritten the rules, reshaped the public's understanding of what royalty was supposed to look like, and placed herself so thoroughly at the center of the modern emotional imagination that the crown itself could not afford to lose her even as it spent years trying to make her go away. The terrifying part was not her popularity. Popularity comes and goes. The terrifying part was her intelligence. Not the academic kind, though she was sharper than the people who condescended to her preferred to acknowledge. The intelligence Diana possessed was something rarer and, in the particular world she inhabited, more dangerous. She could read a room. She could read a face. She could read the public mood with the accuracy of someone who had been studying it since childhood, because childhood in the Spencer household, with its divorces and its grief and its quiet social warfare, had given her a graduate education in human need. She knew what people wanted to feel. She knew how to give it to them. And she knew, with a clarity that never entirely left her, that knowing those 2 things was power of a kind no title could confer and no institution could entirely control. The people inside the palace understood power in the ways institutions understand it, through formal authority, constitutional position, access to the sovereign, control of information, the quiet machinery of precedents and protocol that had kept the monarchy intact through several centuries of history that might otherwise have disposed of it. They understood power as something granted by rank, defined by role, and maintained by restriction. They did not have a category for the kind of power Diana possessed, which was built from none of these things and could not be revoked by any of them. That is what terrified them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand where Diana came from, one has to set aside the myth of Park House as idyllic English country childhood, the noble family, the green lawns, the rosy innocence before the palace complicated everything. Park House was a rented property on the Sandringham estate. The Spencer family had aristocratic credentials going back to the 17th century, which is to say they had been grand long enough that their grandeur no longer required effort, only maintenance. Her father, Edward John Spencer, known as Johnny, was a decent man with a gentle temperament and a talent for horses. Her mother, Frances Ruth Burke Roche, was a woman of considerable force and considerable unhappiness, which is not the same thing, though in the Spencer marriage they arrived together. Frances left when Diana was 6. This fact is often mentioned and seldom properly inhabited. A mother walking out the door when a child is 6 years old is not a plot point in a biography. It is the central event of a childhood, the thing everything else arranges itself around, the absence that teaches a child what presence means by demonstrating what it costs when it goes. Diana did not grow up with a simple understanding that love was reliable. She grew up understanding that love could vanish on a Tuesday, that adults could decide to reorganize the furniture of a child's life without consulting the child, and that the only protection against that kind of loss was either to make yourself so necessary that people could not leave, or to learn how to survive beautifully when they did. She chose both. The first time she lowered her eyes for the cameras, she was 20 years old and standing outside a kindergarten in Pimlico, wearing a skirt the photographers would spend the next week describing in extraordinary detail. She had not intended to be backlit. The sun came through the window behind her, the thin fabric of her skirt went slightly transparent, and the resulting photograph ran on every front page in Britain. She blushed when she saw it. Said it was mortifying. Said she had not known. She almost certainly had known. This is not a story about a naive girl from the English countryside who stumbled into the most photographed marriage of the century and found the machinery frightening. That story has been told so many times it has worn grooves into the culture. It has been told in films, memoirs, documentaries, stage productions, and by no fewer than 3 separate television series, each confident that it alone had captured the real Diana. None of them quite managed it, because the real Diana was considerably more interesting than a victim, considerably harder to reduce than a saint, and considerably more calculating than almost anyone in the palace ever permitted themselves to admit until it was far too late to do anything useful about it. She understood exactly what she was doing. She had understood for longer than people realized. The institution she entered in 1981 had spent centuries surviving difficult personalities, constitutional crises, foreign invasions, plagues, and the occasional monarch who made genuinely catastrophic decisions about France. It had survived abdication, 2 world wars, and a press that had been sharpening its claws since the invention of cheap newsprint. It believed it could survive a 20-year-old from Norfolk who liked pop music and worked with small children. The palace was wrong. Diana was not a weather event the monarchy had to endure. She was a force it had invited inside without understanding what it was opening the door to. And by the time it understood, she had rewritten the rules, reshaped the public's understanding of what royalty was supposed to look like, and placed herself so thoroughly at the center of the modern emotional imagination that the crown itself could not afford to lose her even as it spent years trying to make her go away. The terrifying part was not her popularity. Popularity comes and goes. The terrifying part was her intelligence. Not the academic kind, though she was sharper than the people who condescended to her preferred to acknowledge. The intelligence Diana possessed was something rarer and, in the particular world she inhabited, more dangerous. She could read a room. She could read a face. She could read the public mood with the accuracy of someone who had been studying it since childhood, because childhood in the Spencer household, with its divorces and its grief and its quiet social warfare, had given her a graduate education in human need. She knew what people wanted to feel. She knew how to give it to them. And she knew, with a clarity that never entirely left her, that knowing those 2 things was power of a kind no title could confer and no institution could entirely control. The people inside the palace understood power in the ways institutions understand it, through formal authority, constitutional position, access to the sovereign, control of information, the quiet machinery of precedents and protocol that had kept the monarchy intact through several centuries of history that might otherwise have disposed of it. They understood power as something granted by rank, defined by role, and maintained by restriction. They did not have a category for the kind of power Diana possessed, which was built from none of these things and could not be revoked by any of them. That is what terrified them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand where Diana came from, one has to set aside the myth of Park House as idyllic English country childhood, the noble family, the green lawns, the rosy innocence before the palace complicated everything. Park House was a rented property on the Sandringham estate. The Spencer family had aristocratic credentials going back to the 17th century, which is to say they had been grand long enough that their grandeur no longer required effort, only maintenance. Her father, Edward John Spencer, known as Johnny, was a decent man with a gentle temperament and a talent for horses. Her mother, Frances Ruth Burke Roche, was a woman of considerable force and considerable unhappiness, which is not the same thing, though in the Spencer marriage they arrived together. Frances left when Diana was 6. This fact is often mentioned and seldom properly inhabited. A mother walking out the door when a child is 6 years old is not a plot point in a biography. It is the central event of a childhood, the thing everything else arranges itself around, the absence that teaches a child what presence means by demonstrating what it costs when it goes. Diana did not grow up with a simple understanding that love was reliable. She grew up understanding that love could vanish on a Tuesday, that adults could decide to reorganize the furniture of a child's life without consulting the child, and that the only protection against that kind of loss was either to make yourself so necessary that people could not leave, or to learn how to survive beautifully when they did. She chose both. Prince Charles, heir to the throne of the United Kingdom, was 31 years old in 1979 when he began to spend time around Diana's older sister Sarah. He was in the position he had been in for much of his adult life, which was the uncomfortable position of being expected to marry, having been given no useful instruction in how to do this, and being surrounded by people who wanted to help in ways that mainly involved their own sense of what was best rather than his. His mother had married with the full force of her own conviction and managed it largely well. His father had married for love and then navigated the strange specific loneliness of being a powerful man who had given up his own power for someone else's and spent 30 years working through that quietly, usually by terrifying footmen. Charles had inherited his father's emotional complexity without inheriting his father's talent for converting it into forward motion. He was thoughtful in the way that made some people call him introspective and others call him indecisive, depending on whether they needed him to do something. He loved architecture, painting, gardening, nature, and conversations that moved slowly enough to actually go somewhere. He disliked casual cruelty and was capable of genuine tenderness with people who were suffering. He had also been in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, which was the fact that made all other facts about Charles and Diana make a different kind of sense than they otherwise would. Camilla and Charles had met in 1971. She was warm, funny, at ease in the country world he understood, and unintimidated by his title in the way that made his title feel, for once, like a piece of furniture rather than a sentence. She married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, and the loss settled into Charles in the way certain losses do, not loudly, but permanently. It did not go away. It organized itself into the background of everything that came after. This is the architecture Diana was invited to enter, though she was not given the blueprints, or indeed any drawings at all. She met Charles properly in November 1977 at a shoot at Althorpe, while he was pursuing Sarah. She was 16. He was 29. He found her amusing. She found him interesting. Whether this is entirely true is one of the questions Diana's own later accounts make genuinely difficult to answer with confidence, because Diana's accounts of this period were shaped partly by what she remembered, partly by what she wished had been true, and partly by the extraordinary force of a woman who had learned that the story she told about herself was one of the few things she could still control. What is certain is that she noticed him with the full attention she gave to everyone, and that she was pleasant, warm, and not in the least overwhelming. None of this was accidental. She saw him again in the summer of 1980 at a house party in Sussex. She was 19. He was 32 and increasingly under family and public pressure to find a wife. She sat beside him on a bale of hay, watched him during a television broadcast about Lord Mountbatten, who had been murdered the previous year, and said something that struck him with sufficient force that he remembered it years later. She said he looked sad. She said he needed someone to look after him. She said the right thing at the right moment with the right amount of concern, and it was genuine, which made it more accurate, but it was also precisely calibrated to the part of Charles that most needed to hear it. This was not manipulation in the cynical sense. Diana was not a cold strategist running calculations in her head while performing warmth. The warmth was real. The intuition was real. But the awareness that certain things said to certain people at certain moments could change the direction of a conversation, a relationship, a life, that awareness was also real, and it had been sharpening since she was 6 years old and started learning which adults needed what from her to stay. People who have survived emotionally difficult childhoods often develop this skill to a remarkable degree. Diana had developed it to a degree that was, under the circumstances, almost providential. He rang her. She visited Balmoral. The press began following her. The rest moved quickly, as things do when an institution that has been waiting for something finally believes it has found it. The palace wanted a wife for Charles. More than a wife, they wanted a particular kind of wife. Young enough to be unthreatening, suitable enough to satisfy the old families, pretty enough to satisfy the public, malleable enough to satisfy the officials. Virginal in the old-fashioned sense that still mattered to the people making these assessments, because the Archbishop of Canterbury would be involved and he had views. And English, ideally with good teeth and no complicated romantic history. The palace had a list. Diana did not know she was on it. Or she did know, and the question of how long she had known was one nobody around her ever asked properly. She had grown up on the Sandringham estate. She knew the royal family's world from childhood. She had been embedded in the geography of monarchy before she had any notion of marrying into it. She understood the codes because the codes were the ambient air she had breathed for years. She was not entering an alien environment. She was entering a familiar one from a different door. Whether she loved Charles in the beginning is a question she answered differently at different points in her life, which suggests the honest answer is complicated. She was dazzled by him. She was drawn to the attention he paid her. She was 19 and he was the Prince of Wales, and he was telling her she was special, which is powerful medicine for a girl whose mother had left and whose father had remarried and who had spent years being the cheerful, competent, uncomplaining one in every room she entered. She wanted to be chosen. She was chosen. She said yes. And somewhere beneath the genuine excitement, the dress, the carriage, the cathedral, and the eyes of 750 million people, there was also something else. Something she would not be able to name until later, and would only be able to name publicly later still. She had noticed he sometimes called her by the wrong name. She had noticed he still wore Camilla's cufflinks. She had noticed the bracelet he gave Camilla before the wedding. She had said to her sisters that she could not go through with it, and her sisters had told her, not unkindly, that her face was already on the tea towels. The tea towels comment is one of those details that sounds small until you sit with it. Her face was already a product before she had signed the papers. The institution did not need her to be ready. It needed her to appear. She appeared. In a dress so enormous it barely fit inside the carriage, with a train so long it creased during the ride to St. Paul's and arrived faintly crumpled at the altar. The nation wept. Charles said the wrong name at the altar. Not Camilla's, his vows were correct, but he reversed his own names and had to be gently corrected by the Archbishop. The whole thing was slightly wrong in ways that became, over the following decade, rather too easy to interpret as symbolic. Diana smiled through all of it with the trained radiance of a girl who had been practicing controlled presentation since childhood. She stood at the altar of St. Paul's Cathedral before most of the human beings on earth who had access to a television, and she looked magnificent and entirely composed, and if she was frightened she did not show it, and if she had already noticed that something was fundamentally amiss, she did not show that either. She had learned that lesson very young. Show what is useful. Keep what is yours. The honeymoon on the royal yacht Britannia gave Diana her first extended view of what royal life would actually look like from the inside, and the view was not what the tea towels had suggested. The yacht moved through the Mediterranean. The staff served. The sun was available. Charles brought books, including works by his preferred thinkers, Jung and Lorenz van der Post, and he read them. He fished. He painted. He did the things a man does on holiday when his inner life is organized around private pursuit rather than togetherness. Diana was 20, had never been on a honeymoon before, which is a thing that should not need stating but in this context requires stating, and had expected something different, not from the yacht specifically, but from the proximity. She did not get different. She got the marriage as it would be, which was two people in the same enclosed space with quite different internal weather. She was already struggling with bulimia, a condition she would later speak about with a frankness that required several years of courage and the right television program to build, but which at the time she managed alone, in bathrooms, in the middle of what the world understood to be a fairy tale. She rang her friends from the yacht and cried. She ate, and then she did not keep what she had eaten. The sea moved around her, and the cameras waited on shore, and nobody on the boat knew quite what to do with a princess who had started to disappear from herself in the most literal sense possible. What they did was carry on. The royal family had a gift for carrying on that was sometimes genuine resilience and sometimes a very well-maintained refusal to acknowledge what was happening at the next table. The Queen cared about Diana in the limited, genuine way she cared about most people who came into her orbit, which was structured around duty and formality rather than the kind of close emotional attention Diana needed. The Queen Mother regarded Diana with a kindness that never quite warmed into warmth. Charles was anxious and confused and pulled in the direction of habits and friendships he had spent decades building, and none of those habits or friendships had prepared him to sit with a young woman who was suffering in ways that were not tidy. Diana was not a tidy sufferer. She was an intense one, and intensity in the Windsor family had a long history of being treated as a behavioral problem in need of a better schedule. She went to palace officials and said she was unhappy. They suggested she see doctors. She saw doctors. The doctors were good palace doctors who understood very well which things needed to be said carefully, and which problems were best described in terms that did not reach the newspapers. She felt unheard. This was not paranoia. She was largely unheard. The institution had systems for managing a princess's public schedule, wardrobe, correspondence, security, and travel arrangements. It had no system for managing a princess who was experiencing a crisis of self so severe that she was harming herself in the bathrooms of her own homes. What she did have was time. Time and public appearances. And somewhere in the gap between the suffering in private and the requirement to perform in public, Diana began to understand something that would change everything. She was very, very good at the public part. Not good in the way the palace had wanted her to be good, which was dignified, restrained, slightly distant, and reassuringly decorative. She was good in a way the palace had not encountered before and had no category for. She got out of the car and she turned to the crowd and she was present in a way that was almost physical. She did not scan the faces from behind a professional smile. She looked at individual people. She bent toward them. When a child reached up, she went down to the child's level, not in the performative gesture of a politician's photo opportunity, but in the natural movement of someone to whom the smaller person in front of her was the actual point of the interaction. People who met her at public events described the experience years later with inconsistency that is remarkable given how briefly these encounters lasted. They said she made them feel they were the only person there. They said she seemed to actually listen. They said she seemed, somehow, as though she meant it. She did mean it. This is the part that confuses people who want to describe Diana purely in terms of strategy. She genuinely liked people. She genuinely felt their distress. She had spent her whole childhood reading suffering in other people's faces, and now she was surrounded by suffering people who reached toward her, and her response was instinctive and real. But something else was also true. She noticed what happened when she gave people that attention. She noticed the surge. She noticed the force of it. She noticed that crowds waiting for Charles lit up differently when she appeared, and that the newspapers knew it too, and that the palace knew it and was beginning to feel the first whispers of something nobody yet had a good word for. Unease is perhaps the word. Or inconvenience. The palace was experienced with royal women who were gracious from a proper distance. It had no template for a royal woman who made the distance disappear. Charles noticed. His public life had always relied on a certain kind of attention, the respectful kind, the historically informed kind, the attention of people who were moved by the institution he represented. Crowds had always welcomed him warmly. Now they welcomed him warmly and then looked past him to see where Diana was, and the look on their faces when they found her was something different. It was not merely respect. It was hunger, love, need, the projection of every private longing the public had onto a woman who somehow seemed to receive it without flinching. Charles understood his own value inside the monarchy. He did not understand what he was seeing in those crowds, and understanding it might have made things worse anyway. Diana understood it perfectly. She said in later interviews that she could feel the energy in a crowd, that she could sense what people needed, that the connection was real rather than performed. She was not wrong, but she was also not entirely describing an accidental gift. She was describing something she had worked at, studied, honed, and learned to deploy with increasing precision. The tilted head, the lowered eyes then raised to meet the gaze of one specific person in a crowd of hundreds, the hand that reached back when someone reached forward, the way she bent toward a sick person or an old person or a frightened child. None of this was calculated in the mechanical sense. All of it was chosen, refined, and conscious in the way that any skill becomes conscious once you understand that it is a skill. She had a physical grace in public that was not the practiced grace of formal occasions, not the careful, trained movement of someone who has been taught which way to turn and when to bow. It was looser than that, more personal, occasionally a little awkward in the way real grace is sometimes awkward because real grace is responsive to the moment rather than rehearsed for it. She could walk into a room full of people and find, apparently by instinct, the person who most needed to be seen. People who had organized her visits talked about this quality, with the wonder of people describing something they had watched many times and still could not entirely account for. She did not always go to the most prominent person. She sometimes went to the person standing slightly apart, the one who had not managed to position herself in the direct path of the royal visit, the one who had thought the princess would not notice her, and Diana noticed, and turned toward her, and in that turning created a moment that person would describe for the rest of her life. This was the mechanism of her public power, and it was also, less comfortably, the mechanism of her personal need. She needed to matter to people. She had needed it since she was 6, and her mother left, and the question of whether she mattered enough for someone to stay acquired a weight that childhood does not know how to carry gracefully. She had learned to convert that need into generosity, to turn the hunger to matter into the act of making others feel they mattered, and the conversion was genuine and the generosity was real. But the need was underneath it all, and the crowd, vast and adoring and reaching toward her, was one of the things that answered it. She was not wrong to find comfort there. She was human to find it there. She was also, under the circumstances, making a bargain the institution had not expected and could not control. William was born in June 1982 and Harry in September 1984, and motherhood gave Diana a purpose and an anchor and something else of considerable importance. It gave her the children, and the children were, among many other things, proof that she was not peripheral. The line of succession ran through her. Whatever the palace thought of her, whatever the courtiers said about her in their efficient, carefully worded ways, whatever Charles felt when he looked at her, the future of the monarchy required that she had existed. She loved the boys with a completeness that could alarm people who did not expect it in that context. She wanted them to see the world outside palaces. She took them to McDonald's, which caused a small internal royal crisis of the kind that makes court life occasionally resemble a very expensive sitcom. She took them on the tube. She took them to Disney, to theme parks, to water parks, to ordinary places where ordinary people went and where ordinary behavior was expected of everyone, including her sons, the heir to the throne and his brother, who were expected to queue for rides like everyone else and who apparently did without complaint. She wanted them to understand what the world was made of before the machinery of their future claimed them fully. She wanted them to know her as a person before they knew her as a concept. This, too, was not only instinct. She had watched her own mother become remote, had watched the protocols of her own childhood crowd out the warmth she needed, had seen what happened when children were raised by institutions rather than by people. She was doing something deliberate with her sons. She was making sure they loved her for herself rather than for her role. This mattered for reasons that went beyond maternal emotion. A boy who knows his mother as a person, who has sat beside her on the tube and eaten hamburgers with her and seen her laugh at things that had nothing to do with being royal, that boy would carry her with him differently than a boy who knew her only in formal rooms. She was building something with William and Harry that no courtier could schedule and no palace edict could remove. She was building a relationship with her children that was hers. And it was working, which the palace found entirely admirable in the abstract and rather uncomfortable to accommodate in practice. By 1984, the marriage was in the condition it would remain in for the rest of its formal existence, which was the condition of two people who were deeply unsuited to each other, both suffering in their separate ways, and unable to provide what the other needed because what each needed was not a thing the other was capable of giving. Diana needed consistent love, attention, and the security of being chosen daily, not as a constitutional arrangement but as a human preference. Charles needed space, intellectual companionship, the freedom to be melancholy in his garden, and the company of people who had known him long enough not to require performance. Neither of these things was unreasonable. Neither of them was compatible with what the other needed. They had been married too young, too fast, for too many external reasons, and the palace had believed that duty would smooth the rest. It had not. What the palace did not anticipate was that both of them would look for what the marriage could not provide. Charles moved back toward Camilla, not immediately, but with a terrible inevitability of water finding its level. Diana moved toward friendships, causes, and eventually a series of other relationships that were variously consoling, complicated, and occasionally disastrous, in the way that relationships formed in the middle of personal crisis sometimes are. Both of them were lonely. Both of them told people they were lonely. Both of them were inside an institution that had a very long tradition of pretending that the people inside it were not lonely, because the institution depended on the idea that service and duty were their own rewards, and lonely people are not a compelling advertisement for duty. The bulimia continued. The depression continued. There were moments she later described that had the terrifying specificity of someone reporting from the inside of a crisis, throwing herself against a glass cabinet, throwing herself downstairs while pregnant, cutting herself with a razor on various occasions when the pain inside her found no other exit. She was not telling these stories for shock, though shock was the response of most people who heard them. She was telling them because they were true, and the truth had been concealed for long enough, and she had decided, with a precision that took considerable time to develop, that concealment had protected the institution at her expense for too long. She went to the palace and asked for help. The help offered was insufficient in ways that were not malicious, precisely, but were the result of an institution applying its usual tools to a problem that required entirely different tools. She was given doctors. She was given schedule adjustments. She was given quiet suggestions about perspective and duty and the importance of maintaining the required public face. She was not given the thing she needed, which was genuine acknowledgement that something had gone very wrong and that the palace bore some responsibility for it. This absence became, over time, one of the most important decisions the palace never made. Because Diana, in the absence of help from the institution, began finding other ways to help herself. She began therapy with various practitioners over several years, and the effect of good therapy on a woman as intelligent and as internally rich as Diana was to give her a language for what she had experienced, a framework for understanding it, and eventually a capability for describing it that she had not previously possessed. She was taking the chaos of her inner life and giving it structure. She was becoming, slowly and with considerable difficulty, articulate about her own suffering. An inarticulate princess who was visibly unhappy was manageable. The institution had experience with this. An articulate princess who could explain in precise and moving terms exactly why she was unhappy and whose fault it was, that was an altogether different situation. She was also, in the middle of all this, becoming a genuinely powerful global figure. Not because of Charles. Not because of the palace. Because of herself. Her relationship with the press was the most complex negotiation of her life, and she conducted it with a sophistication that took years to develop and was never fully recognized as sophistication while she was developing it. This is partly because sophistication in managing the media is most invisible precisely when it is most effective, and partly because the easier, more available story was of Diana as victim of the press, which was true and was also incomplete, and which she encouraged at strategic moments because a woman the public sees as being hunted is a woman the public feels protective toward. And protectiveness is more durable than admiration. She had grown up near the royal family, which meant she had observed from childhood how the press worked around the monarchy. She knew the rhythms. She knew which newspapers competed with each other for which kinds of photographs and which kinds of stories. She knew that a photograph of her in an interesting location doing something visually compelling could be on every front page the next morning, and she knew how to make those photographs happen without appearing to have made them happen, which is the most important operational skill in celebrity management and one that most people in that position never master. She understood photographers, not as enemies, which they were when she needed them to be, and not as allies, which they were when that served better, but as elements of an environment she had to navigate intelligently. She memorized names. She remembered details. She spoke to them occasionally in ways that were brief, personal, and suggestive of a relationship in which she was a person rather than merely a subject. This was strategic in the precise sense that it cost her very little and returned genuine dividends, because photographers who feel acknowledged by their subject will often give that subject more agency in how they are represented. They choose the kinder angle. They wait a moment longer for the expression to settle. They do not run the embarrassing frame. She also learned to feed the press when she needed to, through intermediaries and through the calculated placement of information that served her purposes. She was not the only person at the palace doing this. Palace briefings against Diana were a feature of the early 1990s, documented thoroughly enough to form a substantial part of the historical record. She briefed back, not with the same institutional resources but with the superior personal resource of being the one the public trusted. When a story appeared in the newspapers that matched her private position with suspicious accuracy, observers learned to look for the source. She was meticulous about which journalists and which editors she trusted with what. She understood the difference between information given off the record that would influence coverage without direct attribution and information given that would be published directly. She maintained relationships with specific editors over years, not in the transactional way of a politician's press operation, but in the more personal way of someone who understood that relationships are more reliable long-term than transactions. When the squidgy tape was published in the tabloids in 1992, recording a private telephone conversation with James Gilby, the damage to her public image was contained primarily by the fact that what was on the tape was recognizably her, sad, funny, self-deprecating, and entirely human in her descriptions of her unhappiness. The palace had expected the tape to humiliate her. The public found it rather confirmed their understanding of her situation. She had not managed this response. She had not needed to. 15 years of being Diana in public meant that when people heard her voice in private, they recognized the same person. Authenticity, even when technically captured without consent, cannot be weaponized against someone who was telling the truth anyway. The press was simultaneously her greatest tool and her greatest source of personal suffering, and she held both realities at the same time without resolving them into a simpler position, because they were not simple. She genuinely suffered from the pursuit. She genuinely relied on it. She missed it sometimes when it was absent. She dreaded it when it pressed closest to the things she wanted protected, which were essentially her sons and whatever private emotional life she still possessed. The paparazzi who followed her in those final years represented something qualitatively different from the press attention of her earlier royal life. They were not covering a princess on official engagements. They were hunting a celebrity who had become an object of the global attention economy in ways that no protocol could adequately address. She ran from them and they followed. She moved countries and they followed. She varied her routes and they anticipated her. The scale of the following was not merely invasive. It was genuinely dangerous, and the danger was not abstract. She said so repeatedly, and the warnings were not given the weight they deserved by the institutions that might have helped. She had tried to establish a new relationship with the press after the divorce, an understanding that certain aspects of her life would be genuinely private in exchange for reasonable access to other aspects. She asked the newspaper editors to give her space in January 1997. Some agreed. None entirely delivered. The machinery of demand was too powerful to be overridden by gentlemen's agreements, and the supply of photographers too dispersed and too international to be controlled by the willingness of a few editors in London. She was trapped, as she had been in different ways throughout her adult life, in an arrangement that required other people to behave better than they were inclined to. Other people seldom did. The palace's various attempts to manage the Diana situation became, over the decades she spent inside and adjacent to it, an object lesson in what happens when an institution applies its traditional tools to a problem that has outgrown those tools. The palace was excellent at managing information through control, through access, through the careful calibration of what was shown and what was withheld, and through the social pressure of indicating clearly to journalists and editors which coverage would be rewarded with further access and which would result in closed doors. This worked well with journalists and editors who valued the access. It worked poorly with Diana, who did not require the palace's access because she had developed her own. The early attempts were not unfriendly. The palace provided her with a private secretary, an equerry, a press secretary, and the formal support structures it provided to senior working royals. She was not without help. The help was designed for a different kind of royal engagement than the one she was developing. Her private secretary was a former military man, capable, courteous, and trained in the management of official engagements, travel arrangements, correspondence, and the logistical dimensions of royal life. He was not trained in the management of a royal woman who was becoming the most famous person in the world, while also experiencing a mental health crisis and a marital breakdown simultaneously. She went through several private secretaries over the years. The turnover was often cited as evidence of her difficulty, which was partly true and partly the result of the obvious mismatch between what she needed and what the institution could provide. A woman whose primary professional challenge was navigating the emotional dimensions of global celebrity while managing a severe eating disorder and a deteriorating marriage inside a royal family that believed its primary role was to maintain stable appearances, that woman required a different kind of support than the palace had ever needed to offer anyone. The palace's secondary approach, once it became clear that conventional management was not working, was to limit her access to resources that might give her independence. This was not always conscious or deliberate. Institutional systems have a way of constraining people without anyone specifically deciding to constrain them, but the effect was real. Her police protection was discussed and adjusted in ways she found threatening. Her ability to maintain her own relationships with press contacts, charity organizations, and the public was treated as a source of danger rather than as an asset. She responded the way a woman with her particular formation responds to any environment that tries to reduce her to less than she is. She worked around it, through it, and where necessary without it. She developed alternative channels. She maintained relationships outside the official structures. She used the one resource the institution could not confiscate, which was her own presence and her capacity to connect. By the early 1990s, the institutional attempt to manage Diana had produced exactly the opposite of the intended result. She was more independent, more publicly powerful, and more capable of shaping her own narrative than she had been at the beginning of the marriage. The palace's attempts at containment had pushed her to develop capabilities she might not have developed if the support had been genuine. Difficult environments produce certain kinds of strength in people who are constitutionally unwilling to be diminished. She had specific and precise knowledge of the palace's internal operations that she had accumulated over a decade of living inside it, and she used this knowledge carefully. She knew which courtiers were loyal to Charles, which were loyal to the Queen, which were managing competing claims, and which were primarily loyal to the institution in the abstract way of people who serve systems rather than individuals. She knew which information would reach which desks and how quickly. She knew the rhythms of the court circular, and she knew what it reliably did not contain. This institutional knowledge gave her a significant operational advantage when the marriage began its public dissolution. She knew what the palace would do before it did it, not because she had informants, though she did maintain relationships that kept her informed, but because she had watched the institution long enough to understand its habitual responses. When she made a move that the palace had to respond to, she had already prepared for the most likely responses and decided how to answer them. She had a theory of public life, though she never articulated it as a theory, which is partly why it took so long for people around her to understand what she was operating from. The theory was simple enough. People are lonely. People are frightened. People carry suffering they are not given permission to name. When someone with visibility and public standing acknowledges that suffering directly, without euphemism, without the emotional distance that powerful people usually maintain, the effect is profound and lasting and produces a loyalty that is qualitatively different from the ordinary loyalty of a public to a public figure. She had developed this theory partly from her own experience of loneliness and partly from watching what happened in the public encounters she had every week. She had seen it confirmed hundreds of times, in hospital wards, on factory floors, in school gymnasiums, in homeless shelters, in the outstretched hands of people in crowds who were reaching toward her because she represented something they needed and did not know where else to find. She understood what she represented to them. She did not find it simple. She found it, in various moments, wonderful and heavy and frightening and humbling and occasionally too much to carry. She once said that the public was her community, and that when things were at their worst inside the palace walls, the public gave her a sense of purpose and of value. This was true in the straightforward sense. But the public also gave her power. Not the official kind, not constitutional authority or institutional standing, but the much more disruptive kind, the loyalty of people who feel seen by you and who therefore will not willingly hear you diminished. The palace could strip her title. It could not strip the feeling in a crowd when she turned toward it. She felt the tension between these two truths throughout her public life. She needed the public, and she was sometimes exhausted by the public, and she sometimes said and did things that served the public relationship without being entirely in her own interests, and she was aware of this dynamic without being free of it. This self-awareness made her more interesting to talk to than people expected. People who talked to her at any length tended to be surprised by the directness and the intelligence and the humor they encountered. She was not the shy, wounded victim of the public narrative. She was a complicated person who understood the narrative and had made, at various points, the calculation that the narrative served certain purposes even when it did not serve the truth. She could be ruthless in the way that people who have been genuinely threatened develop ruthlessness. She was not sentimental about the institution that had spent years being insufficiently sentimental about her. She was loyal to people who earned loyalty and wary of people who claimed it without evidence. She had a long memory for slights, not in the brooding, ruminative way of people whose identity requires the grievance, but in the practical sense of someone who needs to keep accurate records of who can be trusted. She was also, which gets discussed far less than the other things, genuinely funny. The public person was warm and the private person was warm but also sardonic, quick with an observation, and in possession of the specific sense of humor that develops in people who have survived absurd situations by noticing the absurdity. She could make the people around her laugh with the kind of accuracy that suggests a person who has been watching the world carefully. Several of her closest friends described this quality as a surprise, expecting the Diana of the public image and encountering instead a woman who could puncture pretension with a single sentence and was often a good deal harder on herself than the institution's portrait of her as fragile would have suggested. This does not contradict the suffering. People in pain can still be funny. But it complicates the received picture, and received pictures of Diana have been complicated since the day she entered public life and will continue to be as long as people are interested enough to look. The clothes have been discussed to the point where they almost lose their meaning, but they deserve proper attention because they were not what the fashion press made them, which was a princess indulging personal taste at charitable expense. They were communication. Deliberate, sophisticated, precisely targeted communication in a medium the palace had no mechanism to regulate, no authority to approve, and no vocabulary to criticize without sounding absurd. Diana understood fashion as language at a speed that surprised even people who had worked with her closely. She had started under the guidance of Vogue editors and consultants who helped dress her in the way the palace preferred, which was appropriate and elegant and safe, meaning it gave the public something beautiful to look at while revealing absolutely nothing. This lasted approximately 2 years before Diana started making decisions that gave the palace officials heartburn. She wore a strapless gown to a function, and the picture was on every front page. Not because it was inappropriate, it was not, it was beautiful, it was exactly right for the occasion. Because it showed her neck and shoulders in a way that was striking and modern and slightly removed from the careful modesty the palace had preferred, and it made her look like a woman with opinions about her own appearance rather than an institution's carefully managed product. She began choosing clothes that did things. When she visited Australia in 1983, the crowds were enormous and the public connection was immediate, and the tour became something of a political asset for the crown, and she wore colors that could be seen across large distances, that photographed brilliantly, that made her visible and warm rather than remote and formal. When she met the President of the United States and danced with John Travolta at the White House in 1985, she wore a midnight blue off-the-shoulder gown by Victor Edelstein that became one of the most famous dresses of the century, partly because she looked extraordinary in it, and partly because she moved in it like someone who knew exactly what they were doing, which she did. She learned which silhouettes made her look authoritative rather than decorative. She learned which colors translated in photographs and which disappeared. She learned that a strong, simple statement dress communicated confidence and that elaborate fussiness communicated uncertainty, and she stopped wearing fussy things. She carried handbags in front of her body when she did not want to be photographed easily, a trick so simple and so effective that it was widely copied and rarely credited to her. She wore a revenge dress. The revenge dress deserves its own attention. In June 1994, Charles gave his famous televised interview admitting adultery. The same evening, Diana attended a function at the Serpentine Gallery and wore a short, black, off-the-shoulder dress by Christina Stambolian, figure-hugging, confident, magnificent. The timing was not coincidental. She had owned the dress for several years and had held it back for the right occasion. She had known approximately when the interview would air. She had calculated, without any particular cruelty, that if the evening was going to be dominated by her husband's confession, it would be dominated by it and by her, in a way that told a version of the story that served her rather than him. She left the house wearing that dress, and the photographers went briefly insane, and the next day's newspapers balanced Charles's admission of adultery on one side against the image of his wife looking extraordinary on the other, and the balance was not the one he might have preferred. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This is what strategy looks like when it has been marinated in genuine feeling. She was not cold about it. She was hurt and angry and humiliated and frightened, and she wore the dress anyway, because she had learned that public narrative was a thing she could shape, that the visual story was something she could participate in actively rather than simply endure. The palace never found a way to object to this because it would have meant admitting they were in a competition for the public's sympathy, and the word competition applied to royalty is not one palace officials reach for easily. She also did things with clothes that were quieter and more significant than the famous moments. She wore traditional dress when visiting Muslim countries, not because protocol required it in every case, but because she understood that wearing it communicated respect in a way that words do not, that visual courtesy reaches people who might not hear speeches or read press releases. She carried this sensitivity into every public appearance in countries that were not Britain, and the response was consistent. People responded to her not as a foreign dignitary but as someone who had thought about what meeting them meant. This was not manufactured, but it was conscious. She wore the same earrings twice in different countries, so the photographs would link the visits. She wore British designers when representing Britain and local designers when visiting other countries. She used red repeatedly because she had been told she should avoid it. The palace feeling red was too dramatic and attention-seeking, which was precisely why she wore it. Every decision had a logic, and the logic was hers. The charity work began in the way these things usually begin, which was that a princess is expected to have causes, and causes are chosen with the assistance of advisors who understand which causes are appropriate and which might create complications. Diana was given a list. She chose from the list and then she added to it, and the additions were revealing because they were not the additions of a woman looking for safe, photogenic charity work that would play well in the court circular. She was drawn to suffering that other people in her position found inconvenient. She became patron of Barnardo's, the children's charity, and visited their projects with an attention that went far beyond the ceremonial. She remembered children she had met. She rang follow-up inquiries. The relationship between her and the causes she took on was not the relationship of a patron who shows up for the photographs and is otherwise represented by a check. She showed up, and she showed up again, and she brought with her the full force of her attention, which was considerable enough that the organizations she worked with found it transformative in ways that had nothing to do with the money her involvement raised, though the money it raised was also considerable. Then came the AIDS work, and this was where the strategy became visible as something larger than a personal kindness. In 1987, HIV and AIDS were still widely understood in Britain through a fog of fear, stigma, and misinformation. The epidemic was associated primarily with gay men, intravenous drug users, and people from certain parts of the world, and the public response to it ranged from genuine compassion to open hostility, with a great deal of anxious avoidance in between. The government was producing campaign advertisements that were so frightening they became objects of dark comedy. The press was running headlines that used language that would not be permitted today without significant legal consequences. People with AIDS were being refused treatment, refused housing, refused ordinary human kindness. Diana visited an AIDS ward at the Middlesex Hospital in April 1987. She shook hands with a patient without wearing gloves. The photograph was on every front page. This was not accidental. She knew cameras were present. She knew the photograph would be taken. She understood exactly what shaking that hand without gloves communicated in 1987 Britain, which was everything the government's public health information had struggled to communicate through formal channels. You could not catch HIV through casual contact. You did not need to be afraid. You could touch these people. They were people. The palace was not entirely comfortable with this, because the palace was not entirely comfortable with any cause that required taking a political position in the middle of a public health controversy. The palace preferred causes that were obviously good and obviously uncontroversial and obviously unlikely to be mentioned in Parliament. AIDS work in 1987 did not meet these criteria. Diana did it anyway. She visited AIDS clinics, hospices, and patients repeatedly over the following years, quietly and with genuine continuity rather than the single famous photograph that sufficed for more cautious supporters. She later said that she had felt those patients were suffering the same stigma of not being good enough, the same shame and rejection that she recognized from her own experience. This is probably true, and the connection probably deepened her commitment. But it does not fully explain the strategic clarity with which she chose a cause that the establishment found uncomfortable, put her face and her hands and her presence on it, and in doing so created a moment that did more to change public understanding of AIDS in Britain than almost any formal public health intervention of the decade. She was 26 years old. In the years between the AIDS work and the landmines, she built a body of charity engagement that should be more discussed and less summarized than it usually is, because the summary version misses the texture that made it meaningful and effective. She became patron of organizations that served homeless young people, people with addiction, survivors of domestic violence, people living with cancer, and people with mental illness at a time when mental illness in Britain was still spoken of in the careful, lowered voice of something that would preferably resolve itself quietly without medical intervention. She brought to every cause the same method: genuine presence, genuine learning, and the transformation of individual suffering into public acknowledgement. The method was not simply appearing and shaking hands. She visited Centrepoint, the charity for homeless young people in London, not once for a photograph but repeatedly, and she listened to the young people there with a specific quality of attention that distinguished her charity work from the ceremonial kind. She asked questions and remembered the answers. She wrote letters. She followed up. She talked to workers in the organizations about what was actually needed rather than what was easiest to show a visiting patron, and she used what she learned in the conversations she was having with people who had the power to provide more of it. She had learned, somewhere in the middle of her own experience of needing help and not receiving it within an institution, that the gap between formal support and actual support was where people fell, and that falling in that gap felt specific and personal and left a mark that did not go away simply because adequate-looking arrangements had been made elsewhere. She brought this understanding to every cause she worked with, and it made her useful to those organizations in ways that went beyond the money her name raised, though the money her name raised was very significant. The landmines campaign came later, in 1997, and it was bolder in ways that reflected how much she had grown. By 1997, Diana was no longer a royal wife. She had been divorced for a year. She no longer had the protection and the restriction of official royal status. She was free to choose her causes without palace approval, which meant she was free to choose causes the government actively opposed. The British government supported the international arms trade. Landmines were a product of the international arms trade. Diana's decision to campaign against landmines was, in diplomatic terms, a fairly direct challenge to government policy dressed up, with considerable sincerity, as a humanitarian cause. She walked through a minefield in Angola in January 1997 in a protective visor with a Red Cross advisor beside her, and the photographs made her look like the most serious person in any room she had ever entered, which was saying something. The campaign was controversial in ways she fully understood and deliberately deployed. The Foreign Secretary at the time made remarks suggesting she was a loose cannon engaging with complex political matters she did not properly comprehend. She responded, not by matching the attack directly, but by continuing to walk through minefields in Angola and Bosnia and appearing before the cameras with limbless children and with a particular combination of grief and fierce determination that she had mastered. The photographs answered the Foreign Secretary more effectively than any statement. She did not need to be right about arms policy in every technical particular. She needed to be undeniably present in places where the policy had killed and maimed children. She was there. The Foreign Secretary was not. The campaign helped push the Ottawa Treaty on landmines, which was signed by over 100 countries in December 1997, for months after Diana died. She did not live to see it. She had, however, spent her final months building a coalition of public sentiment that made the treaty politically irresistible for the governments that signed it. She had done this without a government department, without a budget, without formal diplomatic standing, and against the stated preferences of a British government that considered her an interfering amateur. The amateur in question had just helped change international law. She began working with Andrew Morton in 1991 in conditions of considerable secrecy, and the conditions of secrecy tell you as much as the conversations themselves. She did not sit down with a journalist and give interviews. She sat alone in a room with a tape recorder and answered questions that Morton had submitted in advance, and she spoke for hours, and the recordings were smuggled out of Kensington Palace in the kind of arrangement that sounds like a thriller and was, at the level of personal risk she was taking, essentially that. She knew what she was doing. She had calculated the risk, the timing, and the likely response with the care of someone who had been watching how public information worked for a decade. She could not speak publicly while married and within the official royal system. She could not give her own account while everyone around her controlled the official account. The Morton Project was, in its conception and execution, a way of creating a document that existed outside the palace's reach, that would survive regardless of what the palace did, and that told her story in her words before other people's words became the only record. She told Morton about the eating disorder. She told him about the self-harm. She told him about the 5 attempts at what she called cries for help, which others called suicide attempts, a terminological difference that matters and that she navigated with precision. She told him about the loneliness, the isolation, the systematic failure of the institution to support a young woman who was visibly struggling. She told him about Camilla. She told him about the marriage, not with bitterness exactly, but with a clarity that was more devastating than bitterness would have been. She had calculated that the truth, told plainly, would do more work than any accusation. Diana. Her true story was published in June 1992. The palace denied everything, and the denials were not entirely believed. Charles's camp briefed against her, and the briefings were noted. The Queen's advisors attempted to manage the damage, and the damage kept spreading because the book was true, or true enough, and the public knew it was true, and the public had been watching Diana for a decade and recognized her suffering when they finally saw it described properly. She did not admit the tapes existed until after the divorce, when Morton was permitted to reveal the full truth of how the book had been made. The revelation that she had secretly recorded her own testimony while still living inside the royal household was received in some quarters as evidence of calculation. It was evidence of calculation. The alternative description, however, is courage. She was a woman who knew the palace would deny her story, who understood that the word of an institution would be weighed against the word of one woman, and who had found the one way available to her to ensure that her word existed in irrefutable form. She had prepared for the argument in advance, while still inside the house where the argument would take place. This is not manipulation. This is survival under pressure. The year 1992 was a catastrophe for the royal family in the spread of a catastrophe. The Morton Book. The publication of transcripts of a telephone conversation between Diana and a close friend named James Gilby, in which she described her unhappiness in intimate and sometimes desperate terms, and in which Gilby addressed her as Squidgy in a way that made the front pages feel like a cross between a scandal sheet and a personal diary. A fire at Windsor Castle. The separation of Charles and Diana in December. The marriages of Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Charles collectively producing a results board of royal divorce and separation that made the tabloids briefly ecstatic and the palace communications team briefly gray. At the center of all this was Diana, increasingly free, increasingly articulate, and increasingly in possession of something the palace found very difficult to manage. She was winning. Not in the sense of a competition, not in the way the palace preferred to understand these things, but in the sense of public narrative. She was the person the public trusted. She was the person they read about and felt for and defended in conversations. She had not set out to destroy the palace's narrative. She had set out to tell her own story. The fact that her story was true, and the fact that the palace's version had for years been less true, meant that telling her story damaged the institution's credibility in ways the institution found deeply objectionable and entirely difficult to address. You cannot deny a woman's suffering in public once she has found the words for it. You can attempt it, but the attempt tends to confirm the suffering rather than dispel it. The palace attempted it, more than once, more than twice, with more than one briefing and more than one carefully arranged newspaper story suggesting Diana was unstable, difficult, emotionally disordered, too volatile for the demands of royal life. The stories ran. And the public, watching Diana on television, reading her words in the books and interviews she authorized, watching her hold the hands of AIDS patients and walk through minefields and bend to meet the eyes of frightened children, compared the two versions of Diana on offer and chose the one that seemed to them more true. She had understood they would. This was not wishful thinking. She had watched public opinion work for years. She had watched which stories landed and which did not. She had watched herself become the most famous woman in the world and had done so with enough awareness to understand what that meant and how it could be used. She was not naive about it. She was, in this specific area, the most sophisticated operator in any room she entered. The palace's advisors were sophisticated people with long experience. They had managed prime ministers, foreign crises, constitutional questions, and family scandals of various vintages. They had no experience with a royal woman who had mastered the media grammar of the age they were living in better than anyone on their staff had. Their training was in management of information. Diana's instinct was in the management of emotion. In the new media world, emotion was faster, more persuasive, and far more viral than information. They were fighting the last war. She was fighting the war that was actually happening. The Panorama interview in November 1995 was the moment where everything she had been building became visible in one single broadcast, and it terrified them so completely that the Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana within weeks and suggested they divorce. This is worth inhabiting for a moment. The head of state and head of the Church of England, a woman who had opposed divorce for most of her reign on grounds that combined personal conviction with constitutional caution, wrote to her son and his wife and effectively suggested that the damage this woman was doing to the institution was more significant than the institution's previous position on divorce. This is what Diana had achieved with one television interview. She had been secretly preparing for months. She had been meeting with Martin Bashir, the journalist who conducted the interview, without the knowledge of the palace, her private office, or indeed most of the people around her. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, and she had thought about it with a thoroughness that was quite remarkable given that she was also, at the same time, raising 2 children, managing her charity work, dealing with her divorce negotiations, and being followed by photographers every time she left a building. She wore a dark blue Catherine Walker suit that was conservative enough to establish seriousness and modern enough not to look constrained. Her makeup was heavier than usual, her eyes darker, and this was deliberate because she had understood that the camera would read emotion most clearly in the eyes, and she wanted the eyes to speak. She sat in a chair that was slightly lower than the interviewers, which created a visual angle that some television professionals noted later as unusually effective in making her look both vulnerable and direct, which was exactly the combination she required. She answered the questions with a precision that had the quality of having been composed and rehearsed without sounding composed or rehearsed. When she said there were 3 people in her marriage, the line landed because it was short, because it was specific, and because she delivered it with the calm of someone stating a fact rather than making an accusation. She had turned an accusation into a fact by removing the heat from it, and the heat, paradoxically, was all the more present in the absence. She said she had been the source of the Panorama interview when questioned later, in a move that was so strategically bold it was briefly genuinely confusing to the people trying to respond to it. She claimed the interview had originated elsewhere. The claim was false. The palace knew it was false. The public largely understood it was probably false. And none of this mattered because the interview had already aired, the sentences were already in the public record, and the specific sentences she had constructed and delivered with such care were already doing the work she had designed them to do. She said she did not think she would be queen. She said she thought the country needed a different kind of monarchy. She said Charles might not be suited to be king. She said she hoped to be a queen of people's hearts. These were not idle observations. They were targeted. She was not attacking the monarchy as an institution. She was arguing for a different kind of monarchy, a more emotionally accessible one, a more publicly present one, the kind she had been building evidence for throughout her public life. She was making a case for herself as a relevant public figure independent of her marriage, independent of the official royal title she still held but was being pressured to accept the loss of, independent of the palace's approval. She was arguing, in front of 23 million British viewers, for her own necessity. And she was winning the argument, which is the only kind of argument worth making in public. The palace watched the broadcast from the same position the rest of Britain did, which was from in front of a television, and the position was not comfortable. Palace officials, Charles's advisors, and various senior courtiers had been working under the assumption that the formal structures they controlled, official access, institutional communication, press relationships they had cultivated over years, would be sufficient to maintain the narrative of Diana as a problematic, unstable figure whose claims about her marriage should be taken with appropriate skepticism. The Panorama interview made this assumption obsolete in 90 minutes. The technical problem was the simplest to identify. 23 million people had watched. The figure made it the most viewed documentary in British television history at that point. What they had watched was a woman they recognized, sitting in a chair, speaking quietly and with evident feeling about experiences they already half understood from years of watching her. They were not seeing allegations made by a stranger. They were seeing confirmation, given by someone they trusted, of things they had already suspected. The palace could issue statements about the interview being unauthorized, which it was. It could express regret about the breach of protocol, which was real. It could not undo the 23 million people who had watched. The deeper problem was what the interview revealed about the balance of public trust. The palace's authority had always rested partly on the public's willingness to extend it the benefit of the doubt, to accept the institution's characterization of events over alternative characterizations. What Diana had accomplished was to demonstrate that her characterization, her version, her account of what had happened inside the institution, was more credible to more people than anything the palace could offer in response. This was an extraordinary shift in the power dynamics, accomplished without any formal authority, without resources, without an official communications operation, and with a single 75-minute television broadcast that she had organized herself in secret. The palace's response was to strip her of her HRH title in the divorce settlement. She was offered a large settlement, residency at Kensington Palace, and the formal title Princess of Wales without the Her Royal Highness prefix. She accepted the settlement and the residency and lost the HRH. The palace believed the loss of the title would diminish her. This assessment turned out to be incorrect. Diana became, if possible, more Diana after the divorce. Without the restrictions of official royal life, she could move more freely, choose her causes without palace approval, travel without the formal machinery of a royal visit, and speak with a directness that the institutional requirements of her former position had moderated. She was released from the system, and the system discovered, with some horror, that the system had been doing more to constrain her than to create her. She was not a product of the palace. She was a person who had developed a set of extraordinary skills largely in spite of the palace, and when the palace was removed from the equation, those skills did not diminish. They expanded. She hired her own public relations advisor, Jane Atkinson, who lasted a year and departed with comments about Diana's difficulty that made the papers and gave the palace a small, temporary satisfaction. She then navigated without formal PR assistance for a period, which should have been disastrous and was not, because by that point her instinct for managing her own public presence was better than most professional advisors she encountered. She did not need someone to tell her which photographs worked and which did not. She had been making those assessments for 15 years. The charity work expanded rather than contracted. She retained patronages, developed new ones, and the Landmines campaign in the early months of 1997 demonstrated that she was not merely a figure of compassion but a figure of moral authority on a global scale. Prime ministers of other countries took her phone calls. NGO directors flew to meet her. She convened conversations among people who would not otherwise have been in the same room, because her presence was sufficient diplomatic currency to make the meeting happen. She was operating, without portfolio, without title, without official backing, in the space that political figures spend careers attempting to reach. She was also navigating her private life with a combination of desire and imprudence that had characterized her personal relationships for years, which is to say she was a human being with human needs who made decisions that were sometimes excellent and sometimes complicated and occasionally both simultaneously. Her relationship with Hasnat Khan, a heart surgeon, was serious enough that she spent considerable effort attempting to understand Islam and to present herself to his family in ways that would be acceptable, and this effort was genuine rather than performed, and the relationship mattered to her in a way that some around her found moving and others found unsettling. It ended for reasons that were not entirely clear from outside and were, from inside, the reasons serious relationships between people with incompatible lives generally end, which involves the impracticality of loving someone whose world cannot accommodate the level of public attention that follows you everywhere you go. She was not in a stable or settled personal situation in the summer of 1997. She was in the position of someone who had completed one enormous life transition, the exit from the royal marriage, and was in the middle of the next, which was working out who she was when not defined by that marriage. This is a common human situation. The uncommon element was that it was happening in front of 2,000 photographs a week and under observation by the global media. She was doing ordinary human work under extraordinary conditions, and she was doing it without the institutional support she had lost when the divorce was completed and the HRH was removed and the palace's protection became something she could not entirely rely on. She had William and Harry, and the boys were the axis around which the rest of her life organized itself. She knew the divorce had been hard on them in the way divorces are hard on children, which is to say, in the way that depends entirely on how the adults around them manage the event. She tried very hard to manage it well. She tried to speak of Charles without hostility in front of the boys, not always succeeding entirely, but maintaining the attempt. She tried to give them stability in the middle of instability. She kept their school lives as consistent as possible. She rang them from wherever she was, and she went to the school events that mattered, and she showed up for the things parents show up for. William at 15 was already showing the particular quality of young man she had been careful to produce, which was someone who could feel things deeply and also function under pressure, and also retain the awareness that the world contained people whose suffering was not connected to royal palaces and whose existence deserved attention. She had taken him to homeless shelters and AIDS hospices and places where the cushioning between ordinary life and its disasters had been removed, and she had taken him not as a program of official duty, but because she believed he needed to know what the world was made of before he was required to represent it. This was a pedagogical instinct of considerable wisdom and also of considerable courage, because nobody in the official system around her had asked her to do this, and several people had quietly suggested that the heir to the throne should perhaps not be introduced to quite so much distress quite so young. She disagreed. She was right. The adult William, who spoke about mental health with a personal urgency that changed the conversation in Britain, who stood in a hospital and held a child's hand and meant it, who built charitable work around the proposition that human suffering deserved acknowledgement rather than management, was built partly in those early expeditions with his mother. In those rooms where her instinct for direct human contact met her determination that her sons would carry it too. Harry carried her differently, more obviously, more explosively. The anger Harry developed toward institutions that promised protection and provided insufficient care has a genealogy. It runs back to his mother and to the experience of watching what the institution did to her and what it failed to give her when she needed it, and it runs into his own experience of what it felt like to be inside that institution when the institution was prioritizing its own survival over the well-being of the people it claimed to serve. Diana had come to some version of this analysis by the end of her life. Harry arrived at his version faster and expressed it less diplomatically, which is a different approach to the same understanding. The divorce negotiations of 1995 and 1996 were conducted in the way negotiations conducted through intermediaries, palace lawyers, and the morning newspapers are conducted, which is to say with civility that occasionally turned into strategic brutality and brutality that occasionally turned into something approaching courtesy, depending on who needed what that week. Diana wanted several things. She wanted to keep the title Princess of Wales. She wanted Kensington Palace. She wanted a settlement that allowed her to live with the independence and the dignity that her public position required. She wanted a role in her sons' lives that was primary and not managed by the institution. She wanted, in the broadest sense, acknowledgement that she had been damaged by the years inside the system, not in the form of a formal apology, which the palace would have considered extraordinary, but in the form of a settlement that reflected what she had contributed and what she had endured. The palace wanted the HRH removed. This was the issue on which the palace felt most strongly, and understanding why helps illuminate the entire logic of the institutional relationship with Diana. Her Royal Highness was not merely a title. It was a formal acknowledgement of her place within the royal family structure. With it, she occupied a constitutional position that required the public and official world to treat her as royal in a technical, measurable sense. Without it, she was a wealthy, famous woman with children in the line of succession and a global public platform, but she was not formally royal, and that distinction gave the institution a useful handle on what she represented. She lost the HRH. The palace won that negotiation. She gained the settlement, the palace, and the access to her sons that mattered most. The institutional question of the title was less important to her than the personal questions of the boys and the resources and the freedom. She had understood very clearly that her power did not come from her title. She did not need the palace's formal acknowledgement to be Diana. The public would call her the Princess of Wales regardless of what the court circular said, and they did, and the palace's formal decision on the matter produced years of slightly embarrassing split-screen moments in which the official record said one thing and the public mood said another, which is a fairly accurate description of Diana's entire relationship with the institution. The settlement was reported at somewhere in the region of £17 million, along with the apartment, the car, the staff, and the continued access to royal family events that involved her children. She was not rich in the way the public imagined her to be, not independently rich, not rich in the way that would have freed her entirely from financial considerations. But she was comfortable, and she was free, and the freedom was what she had been waiting for since she first understood that the institution was not going to give her the things she needed. The first year after the divorce showed what Diana looked like without the palace as a direct constraint, and the picture was striking. She moved faster. She chose her own engagements. She spoke more directly. She wore what she chose without consultation. She made decisions about her public appearances on her own timeline and according to her own priorities, and the priorities she revealed were entirely consistent with what she had been building toward for years. More direct contact with people suffering, more political edge, more willingness to occupy the space that the palace had always considered too charged for a working royal. She was not a working royal any longer. She was something the world did not have a clean category for, a former princess who had retained all the public recognition and none of the official constraints, and she was using the situation with an efficiency that made some people uncomfortable and made the causes she worked with deeply grateful. The settlement was reported at somewhere in the region of £17 million, along with the apartment, the car, the staff, and the continued access to royal family events that involved her children. She was not rich in the way the public imagined her to be, not independently rich, not rich in the way that would have freed her entirely from financial considerations about how she deployed her public position. But she was comfortable, and she was free, and the freedom was what she had been waiting for since she first understood that the institution was not going to give her the things she needed, and that waiting for it to do so was a form of surrender she could not afford. The first year after the divorce showed what Diana looked like without the palace as a direct constraint, and the picture was striking. She moved faster. She chose her own engagements. She spoke more directly. She wore what she chose without consultation. She made decisions about her public appearances on her own timeline and according to her own priorities, and the priorities she revealed were entirely consistent with what she had been building toward for years. More direct contact with people suffering, more political edge, more willingness to occupy the space that the palace had always considered too charged for a working royal. She was not a working royal any longer. She was something the world did not have a clean category for, a former princess who had retained all the public recognition and none of the official constraints, and she was using the situation with an efficiency that made some people uncomfortable and made others, particularly the causes she worked with, deeply grateful. There was a speech she gave in 1997, in Washington, to a conference on landmines, that gives a clearer picture of the Diana who had emerged from the divorce than almost anything else from that period. She was not reading from the official safe text of a royal engagement. She was making a case. She walked the audience through what she had seen in Angola and Bosnia, the specific details, the faces, the limbs, the children who would not be walking without prosthetics if they were walking at all. She spoke about the political dimensions of the issue with the accuracy of someone who had done the work of understanding it, not only the emotional dimensions, though those were present and genuine, but the structural and strategic dimensions, the relationship between arms policy and humanitarian consequence, the responsibility of governments that made money from the trade and the populations who lived with the debris. A government minister at the time said she had no place in political debate. This was a strange remark to make about a woman who had just given an accurate, sophisticated, emotionally compelling public case for a policy change that would save lives, but it had the quality of a reflex rather than a considered position. The reflex was, she should not be in this space. The considered position, when anyone bothered to form one, was harder to sustain, because she clearly knew more about the practical consequences of the policy than the minister who objected to her participation. She had spent the previous 6 months reading and meeting and listening. She had met amputees and aid workers and doctors and survivors. She had walked through minefields with people whose job was to clear them and understood the mechanics, the types of mines, the detection methods, the scale of the problem in countries the British public did not follow closely. She was not a tourist of suffering. She was a person who had identified a cause, determined to understand it in depth, and was deploying every tool available to her to move the public and political needle on it. The tools available to her were, at this point, considerable. Her face on a television screen caused people to pay attention who would not pay attention to an aid worker or a government minister saying exactly the same things. She knew this. She did not pretend otherwise. She understood the nature of the attention she commanded, and she used it in service of causes she found genuinely important. Whether she was right on every policy point is a separate question, and the answer is not entirely yes, because she was working from deep concern rather than technical expertise in every case. But the direction was clear and the intention was serious, and the outcomes, measurable in changed behavior, changed public understanding, and in the case of the landmines campaign, changed international law, were real. This was the woman in her mid-30s. This was what she had built from the combination of native intelligence, acquired strategic understanding, 16 years of experience inside and alongside the world's most watched institution, and the specific, hard-won clarity of someone who has survived things and knows what she survived and why. She was not finished. She was, if anything, accelerating. The final year was not the chapter of a woman winding down. It was the chapter of a woman who had finally, at 36, arrived at something like her full capability. She did not get to find out what she would have built next. Her last summer, the summer of 1997, had the quality of movement and possibility that suggested the next chapter was forming. She was 40 months out of the divorce. She was working on the landmines campaign. She was photographed with Dodi Fayed, the son of Mohammed al-Fayed, aboard his father's yacht in the Mediterranean, and the photographs of her looking sun-tanned and relaxed and apparently happy in the company of someone who clearly found her wonderful were studied with the intensity that photographs of Diana had always been studied. There was discussion about whether she was in love. There was discussion about whether she was making good decisions. There were family concerns and friend concerns and public concerns expressed with varying degrees of self-awareness about the extent to which any of these concerns were actually welcome. She was 36 years old. She had survived a marriage that had attempted to consume her, an institution that had at various points actively tried to undermine her, a decade of public scrutiny that had examined every aspect of her existence, and a mental health crisis that might have ended different for a woman with fewer resources. She was planning her charitable foundation. She was speaking about withdrawing from public life to a reduced and more private degree. She had been talking to William about this, about finding a way to live that gave her more ordinary space. She did not get the chance. On August 31, 1997, at 12:23 in the morning, Diana died at the Piti-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris after the car she was in crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. She was 36 years old. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. The driver, Henri Paul, died at the scene. The bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, survived with very serious injuries. The world received the news with the stunned quality of the genuinely unprepared. Diana had been too famous, too visible, too present for mortality to seem plausible in relation to her. The crowds that gathered at Kensington Palace in the days that followed brought flowers until the flowers became a topography of their own, a geography of public grief so dense and so sincere it changed the social weather of London for a week and changed the emotional expectation of what the British public would accept from its monarchy for considerably longer. The palace's response to Diana's death became one of the defining moments of the crisis that followed it. The royal family remained at Balmoral. The flag over Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast, following protocol that the flag only flew when the monarch was in residence. The Queen did not appear in London immediately. The silence read, in the raw emotional atmosphere of that week, not as dignified protocol but as cold indifference, and the public fury that built around this reading was vast and enormous and genuinely frightening to the people inside the palace, who had not anticipated the scale of what Diana's death would release. There were senior figures within the palace who had been managing the Diana situation for years and who had developed a set of understandings about the public mood that now proved catastrophically wrong. They had understood the public's feeling for Diana as the feeling for a celebrity, intense but manageable, shaped by image and media and therefore subject to the ordinary cycles of celebrity affection that rise and fall according to what is being written and shown. They had believed that the removal of her title, the reduction of her official role, the gradual replacement of her image in the royal family's public communication by other figures, would accomplish over time what nothing had accomplished instantly, which was the normalization of her absence from the official picture. What the crowds outside Kensington Palace showed, in the sheer quantity of flowers and the nature of what was written on the cards attached to them, was that the public's connection to Diana was not built on celebrity mechanics and could not be ended by celebrity mechanics. It was built on something more personal and more lasting. People had watched her for 16 years. They had watched her suffer in ways they recognized from their own lives. They had watched her try and sometimes fail and try again. They had watched the institution treat her badly and watched her survive the treatment. They had taken her story personally in the way that people take personally the stories of someone who has shown them their own experience reflected back in a public and acknowledged form. The grief was grief for a specific person they felt they knew, and that is the kind of grief that does not observe the usual timelines. This was the final lesson she taught, and she taught it posthumously, and it terrified them as much as anything she had done while alive. The institution had spent years managing Diana, diminishing her, stripping her title, trying to reduce her to a managed and contained problem. It had believed that the formal instruments available to it, title, access, official standing, proximity to the monarch, were the source of her power, and that removing these instruments would remove the power. The week after her death demonstrated, with total clarity, that the institution had fundamentally misunderstood where her power came from. Her power had never come from her title. It had come from the fact that 23 years of being Diana had produced a relationship between her and the public that was not mediated by any institution and could not be revoked by any palace memo. The people in the streets outside Kensington Palace were not there because of HRH Princess of Wales. They were there for Diana. The distinction is everything. William and Harry were told to walk behind their mother's coffin, and William said he did not want to, and Harry said he would not walk unless William walked, and Philip, who understood the specific quality of grief in young boys better than most people credited because he had spent a childhood learning to carry his own losses in motion, reportedly told William that if he walked, Philip would walk beside him. And they walked. Two boys whose mother had spent 15 years making sure they knew her as a person, not only as a princess, walked through London while the world watched, and the grief on their faces told the story of what Diana had built with her children, the real and irreplaceable relationship that no institution had ever been able to give them and no institution had ever been able to take away. The funeral. The sermon by Tony Blair's advisor Alastair Campbell had shaped the Prime Minister's response, but the eulogy was Earl Spencer's, Diana's brother, who stood in Westminster Abbey and said sentences that cut through the marble and the ceremony to the exposed nerve of what had actually happened in the relationship between Diana and the people around the throne. He spoke of a girl who received no official guidance and was frankly ridiculed for the wrong that she was doing. He described a unique, complex human being who transcended nationality in a manner unique to this century. He ended with a promise to the boys that they would be ensured their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition but can sing openly as you planned. The applause started outside the Abbey, among the crowds watching on screens, and rippled inward until it was audible inside the nave, which had not applauded at a funeral in its 950 years of formal existence. The applause was for the eulogy and for Diana and for the 8 years of accumulated feeling the public had carried for a woman who had, from the beginning, given them something real when the institution around her was giving them protocol. They gave it back the only way available to them, with their hands. She had known, on some level, the weight of what she carried. She spoke about it in the Panorama interview and in other contexts with a self-awareness that was not false modesty but genuine reckoning. She knew the public needed her to be certain things. She knew the Diana they loved was partly a projection. She knew that no human being can survive indefinitely as the vessel for a nation's longing. She had said she wanted to step back from some of the public role. She had said she needed ordinary life alongside the extraordinary parts. She was looking, in that final summer, for a way to be Diana the person more often and Diana the symbol less. She did not get to find out if that was achievable. She had spent 16 years demonstrating what it looked like when a woman with genuine emotional intelligence, genuine instinct for human connection, and a genuine hard-earned understanding of public power operated inside the world's most watched institution. She had done it without a rule book. She had done it in the face of sustained institutional opposition. She had done it while managing a mental health crisis that might have silenced a less determined woman, while raising 2 children in the middle of a public battlefield, while conducting her charity work with a level of genuine commitment that the causes she supported measured in outcomes rather than appearances. She had also, in doing all of this, illuminated with absolute clarity the emotional poverty of the institution she had left, and the institution had never forgiven her for it. The palace had wanted a decorative young woman who would photograph well and produce heirs and stand in the correct position at public events and not ask too many questions about any of the arrangements. What it got was a woman who became the most powerful communicator the monarchy had encountered since it invented printing presses to manage its own narrative. What it got was someone who understood that the public would follow feeling before they followed protocol, that a human face bent towards suffering did more for the monarchy's public standing than 1,000 official ceremonies, and that the woman offering that face was not a creation of the institution, but a person who had forged herself out of difficulty and loss and the specific education of an unhappy childhood that had taught her to see what people needed. The palace's mistake was the mistake powerful institutions always make with people who do not fit their categories. They looked at Diana and saw a girl in a good dress. They saw the shyness and the deference and the lowered eyes and the appropriate comportment, and they thought, manageable. They did not notice what the lowered eyes were doing while they were lowered. They were reading the room. What she built still exists in ways that resist the usual ways of measuring such things. The charitable landscape she shaped is measurable in organizations still working, in treaties still in force, in the reduction of stigma around HIV and AIDS in Britain that cannot be traced to any single intervention, but that anyone who was alive in 1987 and is alive now can attest to by comparison. The style she created became the dominant grammar of royal public engagement for the generation that followed her. Kate Middleton, Princess of Wales, practitioner of the same careful listening, the same bent-forward warmth, the same gift for making one person in a crowd feel seen, is operating in a mode that Diana essentially invented for modern royalty, and that the institution spent a decade refusing to codify before quietly making it standard. The palace took her template and used it without acknowledging where the template came from, which is probably how institutions should behave if they want to avoid the particular embarrassment of crediting the person they spent years trying to diminish. But the debt is not invisible to anyone who has watched both. The close human contact. The willingness to meet people at the level of their suffering rather than from above it. The understanding that the public wants feeling from the monarchy and that feeling needs to be real to be effective. These were Diana's discoveries, made in the middle of her own crisis, tested in wards and charities and public engagements over 16 years, and they are now standard royal operating procedure. This is the peculiar afterlife of a woman who died young and famous. She haunts the institution she left. Not in the Gothic sense, not as an accusation or a rebuke, but as a standard against which subsequent royal women are measured whether they wish to be or not. Every Princess of Wales will be compared to her. Every royal mother will be evaluated partly in the shadow of her mothering. Every public engagement of warmth and human contact carries a trace of her influence, because she changed what the public expected from royalty, and the public has not gone back to the earlier expectation. She changed it not by demanding change, not by issuing manifestos, not by giving speeches about what the monarchy should become, though she made pointed observations about the monarchy she could imagine. In the Panorama interview, the observation that she hoped to be a queen of people's hearts was understood at the time as a romantic flourish, which it also was, but was primarily a policy statement about what she thought the monarchy required. She was right. The evidence is in the 30 years since her death, in what the monarchy has scrambled to provide that she had already demonstrated could exist. Her sons carry her. William carries her in his public seriousness, his concern about mental health, his desire to be present to his children in ways his own childhood made difficult, his understanding that the monarchy had to give the public feeling alongside duty, or the duty would eventually seem insufficient justification for the monarchy's continued expense. Harry carries her differently, in the rawer form, in the openness that she might have wished she had been permitted to develop sooner, in the anger at institutions that demand performance while providing insufficient care for the people performing, in the sometimes catastrophic directness that can make Harry seem imprudent and that made Diana seem dangerous when the palace preferred her quiet. She changed the monarchy by forcing it to decide what it actually was. Before Diana, The monarchy could sustain the position that distance was dignity, that restraint was respect, that the public's role was to admire and the royal family's role was to be admired, and that the entire arrangement was essentially fine as long as everyone maintained their positions. Diana made that position untenable, not by attacking it, but by demonstrating what its alternative looked like. She showed what happened when a royal woman actually connected with people rather than processing them. The response was overwhelming, and the implications were impossible to ignore. After Diana, the monarchy had to decide if it was going to become more like what she represented or less like it. The answer it chose, slowly and with considerable internal resistance, was more like it, which is why the institution that spent years trying to diminish her now manages its public presence according to principles she developed, in a palace she once lived in styles of engagement she essentially created. The most interesting part, the part that reveals everything, is that she developed these principles under pressure, in distress, without support, against the active opposition of the institution she was simultaneously serving. She figured it out because she had to, because the alternative was to be consumed by the machine, and she was not going to be consumed by the machine. She had grown up watching machines, the family machine, the social machine, the machinery of aristocratic England, and she had learned earlier than anyone around her understood that machines can be operated by people who understand how they work. She understood that she had to prove herself inside a system that had decided in advance what she was, which is the oldest disadvantage available. Every woman in public life understands this disadvantage to some degree. Diana encountered it in its most formal, ancient, and institutional form. She had been assessed before she walked through the door. She had been found suitable in the categories the institution cared about, and not particularly worth inquiring about in the categories it did not. She had been given a role and expected to inhabit it without complaint and with adequate grace, and the role had been designed by people who thought they knew what they needed and had very little curiosity about what she might turn out to be. She turned out to be something they had not designed for and could not accommodate, which was someone who understood the game, played it on her own terms, and walked away from the table when she had decided the terms were no longer acceptable. She understood how the machine worked. She worked it accordingly, and the people who built the machine spent the last decade of her life discovering that they had given access to someone with a better grasp of its possibilities than they themselves possessed. The lowered eyes, the tilted head, the hand extended to a dying man in a hospital ward, the midnight blue gown at the White House, the testimony dictated to a tape recorder in the middle of the night, the minefield in Angola, the revenge dress, the Panorama interview, the walk through London on a September morning with her 2 boys behind her coffin. None of it was accidental. All of it was Diana. The institution had wanted a princess. What it received was something it had never encountered and never entirely recovered from. A woman who was paying attention the whole time. That was always the thing they could not manage. She was paying attention. She saw them clearly. She understood what they feared and what they needed and what they would never admit. She understood the gap between what the monarchy presented and what the monarchy was, and she knew that she stood in that gap, and she knew the gap was visible. And when she decided to describe what she could see from where she stood, in her own words, on the record, on television, to the largest audience available, there was nothing they could do about it. The palace could manage many things. It could not manage a woman who had already told the truth to 23 million people before anyone inside the building realized she had made the appointment. She had known what she was doing. She had known for years. And that was always going to be the thing they could not forgive. The grave at Althorpe is on a small island in an ornamental lake. Her brother chose it because it would give her privacy after years without it, because it is not readily accessible, because the effort required to reach it creates a natural barrier against the casual and the intrusive. There is something fitting in that. A woman who spent her adult life visible beyond any reasonable expectation of visibility, finally given a place the cameras cannot easily reach. Visitors come anyway. They bring flowers. They stand at the water's edge and look across, and sometimes they write messages in the book her brother keeps at the house. Some of the messages are for Diana the symbol, and some of them are for Diana the person, and some of them are for the version of Diana the writer carries inside them, the one built from photographs and documentaries and books, and the one moment years ago when they stood in a crowd and she turned toward them and the world stopped briefly being enormous and became instead just two people in a moment, which was the thing she always offered people and the thing that could not be manufactured and the thing the institution never once understood how to replicate. They could take her title. They could not take what she had given people, which was the feeling of being seen. She had understood that the feeling of being seen was the only currency that mattered, in any room, anywhere, at any level of power. She had understood it at 6, when her mother left. She had sharpened it at 19, when she began learning what it meant to be the thing people looked at. She had deployed it for 16 years with increasing skill, increasing confidence, and increasing awareness of what she was doing and what it meant. She was paying attention. She saw what the room needed. And she gave it every time, in every photograph, and in every ward, and in every minefield, and in every crowded street, and in every studio, and in every moment when the cameras were present and the cameras were not present, and there was just a person in front of her who needed someone to notice them. She noticed them. That was what she was doing. That was what terrified them. And that is why, 3 decades later, the world has not found anyone else quite like her, and the institution she haunted still organizes its public face around the principles she wrote without a manual, in distress, under pressure, in the middle of the most watched unhappy marriage in history, using tools she invented herself because no one else had thought to invent them yet. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was doing it from the beginning. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.